Okay, so we are now live. This webinar is being recorded as well too. So Franklin, Daniel, how are you both doing today? Ready for the hour ahead?
Certainly. Thanks, Christian.
Doing great, Christian. Thanks for setting this up. Great to be here.
So for everyone that's joining us right now and just starting to get settled in, we're going to get started in just a moment. As a reminder, and just to make sure that you're in the right place and on the right Zoom link. As we all know, we have many Zoom links floating around. Today, FutureVault and AppCrown will be talking about all things books and records and document management compliance. We're going to share a bit about how our digital document vault solution here at FutureVault is helping broker-dealers and advisory firms in real time meet compliance, gain operational efficiencies through massive time and cost savings, and importantly, in an area that we feel deserves the utmost attention in 2023 and beyond, delivering an enhanced digital client experience. We'll officially kick things off first and foremost on behalf of both organizations that are co-hosting this, FutureVault as well as AppCrown. We want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy days to join us. We know that you're all incredibly busy professionals, so we feel thrilled that you're deciding to spend the hour with us. On that note, we're looking forward to today's discussion. It's been a while since we've hosted a webinar, but most importantly, we're most excited about the value that we think you're going to get out of this webinar, the information and the details, and some of the knowledge that we'll share that you can then take back to your teams. So today, we'll kick off with quick introductions. Of course, it's always nice knowing who you're speaking to, backgrounds. We'll provide some company backgrounds as well too on both FutureVault and AppCrown. Once we get that started, we're going to jump right into the 6 most common challenges and concerns that we're seeing today with respect to books and records and document management compliance. I'll then share a quick anecdote that I'm sure many of you here on this webinar can actually relate to or sympathize for. And then we'll cover 3 major rulings in consideration. So we'll jump into the SEC Rule 17A4, Section F, which is the worm requirement. Franklin and Daniel are going to unpack the audit trail amendments. The second ruling or topic being discussed today will be the new marketing rule, like we talked about, vendor due diligence. Once we're done those, what we're actually going to do is demonstrate how the FutureVault platform, and rather how firms can and are actively taking advantage of the FutureVault platform to protect enterprise, advisor, and client documentation all within one environment rather than using disparate systems. So let's go ahead. Let's jump right into introductions. I've been talking for way too much. Daniel, why don't we kick things off with you, if that's okay? Maybe share a bit about your background and an overview with FutureVault.
Sure, will do. And thanks, Christian, for, again, setting this up, and nice to meet everyone today. So a bit on my background. I'm currently the CEO of FutureVault. Prior to starting at FutureVault, I was 22 years with HSBC, and I had a variety of roles, primarily in Asia, in Japan and Indonesia. And then I went to New York, and when I was in New York, I became very exposed to the regulatory environment, dealing with regulators like the OCC, and ensuring that a global bank, can demonstrate compliance with regulation. And generally that happens through evidencing documents and artifacts. So I spent a lot of time working in front of regulators throughout my career as COO of the bank. And when I joined FutureVault, I saw the platform, I saw the applicability of using the platform with that lens, and joined as COO and then took over as CEO in January of last year. So a bit of background on FutureVault. We're a B2B2C white labeled platform for delivering digital vaults, ultimately to clients, to investors, but we tackle that across the various tiers of an organization, starting at the head office to an advisor to a client. And we'll get into a bit more detail of that later. These are some of the clients that we have. We're primarily in Canada and the US. We have won some awards. These are not pay to play. We have 3 patents granted. We do have scale. We're live. We have the vaults live in production. To grow that over the next couple of years. And getting to the compliance angle, we are PCI DSS compliant, SOC 2 Type 2. And of course, we're very conscious of SEC and FINRA requirements in the US, and that's the focus of this call. Thanks, Christian. Back to you.
That's great. Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate that and the company overview there. Franklin, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now, if that's okay. Same thing. Your background, your current role with AppCrown, and then some more information about AppCrown and maybe even the relationship between AppCrown and FutureVault.
Thank you, Christian. Really kind to the invitation and getting a chance to join the FutureVault's webinar here. So by background, I'm a growth advisor for AppCrown. We're an integration engine for financial advisors, independent broker-dealers that may use Salesforce as a CRM. They may want to have that integrated with multiple custodians, one or two clearing providers, whether it's Pershing, NFS, and want to see that holistic CRM experience with integrated financial data and digital vault, which is where we connected with FutureVault, as it's been a high demand product for SEC advisors and independent broker dealers looking to really protect their firm from all different corners, as Christian, you've alluded to, and Daniel, as you've as well outlined in that capacity. And on my side, I wear as well, from a standing perspective, also an SEC registered advisor through a family office of ours, as well as a certified senior advisor for senior members in the population of the United States. So different perspectives in that regard, and seeing a lot of demand for document retention, digital vaulting. We believe have a strong thesis that digital vault is going to become a critical aspect for a lot of the firms in the industry. So thank you, Christian.
Really appreciate that, Franklin. So a little bit about myself. I'm currently the Chief Marketing Officer here at FutureVault, and I've been working in fintech for about the last 7 years or so. I was previously the head of marketing at a company called Saveology, financial planning technology startup. And prior to that, I was also in the same space in the financial planning technology startup, a company in Canada called Planswell. During that time, I was also actively engaging as an advisor to several different B2B and B2C technology companies. I've been focusing a lot of my time now in the wealth tech space. I think we'll jump right into some of these challenges. I would say there's probably about 6 common challenges. And Franklin, Daniel, at any point in time, feel free to chime in here. During our time in our discussions with broker dealers, family offices, registered investment advisors, other financial institutions that are looking at our digital vault as a potential solution for their firms and their institutions, or ones that are currently using it, we're noticing that there are 6 common challenges and concerns that always come to the table when we talk about document management compliance. By the way, these are in no particular ranked order. This is just the order that we decided to put them on the page. But the first one here that we want to talk about is ensuring that there's the proper retention period for all types of records. In particular, the SEC Rule 17A4, sections A all the way through E, probably the different rules for records preservations. And so organizations really need to make sure that they have the capabilities and the proper technology in place to retain relevant content and data for those retention periods. And it's usually about at least 6 years. So that's number one. Number two, and we're going to talk more about this right after, is just ensuring that the records are being stored in a non-rewritable and non-erasable format. So essentially that's what the WORM requirement is just that documents in the evidence records are not deletable. You can't change them. You can't alter them. And so just making sure that you have the right storage capabilities. And as you see here, there's an audit trail alternative to that particular section in the SEC 17A4. Franklin and Daniel are going to talk more about that because that's a really interesting and a new amendment that just recently passed. And I think, it's still something, Franklin, would you say that not a lot of firms are really all that familiar with, or even, have that baseline level of knowledge?
Christian, I would agree with that. I would say a lot of firms are familiar with the WORM, and there's a lot of history there. And the alternative for audit trail, as a choice of saying, let's sunset WORM, because that's a high cost solution to a digital, more innovative and modern format at a lot lower cost too, in an environment that really demands that. A lot of advisors of large scale and under SEC and then the IBDs and the FINRA, they may not be aware of this.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And like I said, we'll jump into a more lengthy discussion on that in particular, and how firms should be approaching this moving forward. Number 3 on our list here of the common challenges would be scattered and disparate systems. And this is something that we see all the time. It happens to every single firm, regardless of the size, who you're registered with, the segment of the market you're in. In particular, what we really notice is that we're seeing that there are different document management or even vaulting solutions being used for the different types of documents across the organization. So for example, what I mean by that is that one system might be used to maintain and store your enterprise or your compliance documents. Maybe that's something that's obviously just for internal uses only. Then there's another system that's being used for the documentation that either advisors need to keep on hand themselves, or that, let's say, head office or broker-dealer needs to share with the advisors. And then what we're noticing is that there's a third one coming to the table usually, and that's for client documents, either being stored in a different location where it's pretty inaccessible for clients, or maybe it is accessible to clients, but all of the other documentation still remains scattered. And so that's a huge problem when it comes to being able to discover and retrieve records effectively. And then you add into the mix if physical records are still being used, of course, too. So that's sort of the fourth layer on top as well. The next one here is the inability to efficiently evidence those documents, but not only making sure that you're evidencing the documents in a proper solution, but making sure that the way you're carrying out audits is smooth, it's seamless, it's easy for the auditors to go in there and find the right types of documents that they're looking for. So we're noticing that that's a major hurdle as well too. And we're helping firms in real time button that up.
And I'm just going to step in there too. That is
Yeah.
such a legitimate issue, right? So if imagine your firm is going to be audited or regulated or internal audit, aggregating and stitching together holistic documentation and records across all levels of the enterprise, all the way down to the client, disclosures to clients. That could include, how do you know that all of your advisors have read the latest compliance policy procedure manual? So stitching together that holistic view across the enterprise, here is what I can provide to an auditor or a regulator on demand without having to scramble around. You're given that notification that you're going to be audited in 3 months. I need to see 50 of your client files and all the email-based interaction with the client. How can you prepare yourself and have that available technically on demand? So there's that element of assuaging yourselves as a firm, and regulators and auditors might get suspicious. Why is it taking you so long to find all these documents? So there's an element of credibility too. It's like, here it is, it's on demand. And by the way, and we'll show this in the platform, we can permission you right into our platform and you can see these documents coming in real time, time-stamped if you wanted to. The last point I'd make is the cost, right? The disparate systems means that you might be duplicating file storage in some parts of the organization. It's inefficiently priced. You're being arbitraged. You want to have everything in one-stop shop. So it ties together also the cost lens, the ROI on a platform, and the ability to respond to compliance requirements, internal, external, timely evidencing of documents, showing that you're doing what your procedures are established and that you're reconciling that with regulation. The regulation says this, here's my policy, here's my procedure, here's the documentation that I can show that whole end-to-end journey to a regulator or internal auditor.
I really appreciate the color there, Daniel, especially from your background. And what about, this fifth point here is actually really interesting. This is something that the three of us have talked about quite a bit recently, especially doing a little bit of prep coming into this conversation. Data ownership concerns. And what we mean by that is the documents or the data living in custodial logins. Daniel, any color you can provide on that one? Because that's a big one. And Franklin, you too, of course, that's a big one that we're seeing a lot, especially if an RIA, for example, is using multiple different custodians, right? Then there's multiple different point solutions that either an advisor or key staff or even clients now need to go in and log into. So it kind of ties into the disparate solutions, but it's a whole nother challenge and concern in and of itself.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think the issue you nailed was who's responsible for the documentation and data and evidencing, right? And the delineation between the broker-dealer, the advisor, the custodian, and the client, et cetera. And so an RIA could say, look, these documents are maintained by my custodian. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're responsible for that, and so is the broker-dealer. So it's ensuring that that lineage and chain of command of the documents are in the right spot. That ties into your document retention point you made earlier, the 7-year, whatever the type of document is, and depending on the regulation and jurisdiction that you happen to be doing your business in, making sure that you have coverage and you're not relying on a third party that you're unaware of. And you find out the hard way that actually they've deleted those documents for their own data retention purposes, and you no longer have that evidence that you need for an audit that you have. So it's that ownership, the chain of command, where it sits, and control over that for your clients, for your broker-dealer, for their RIA, and for the client, right? That client will have to evidence tax returns for a certain number of years. And the whole premise of a digital vault is that it's not just for the enterprise, it's for the client. So the client will also have in their personal life management vault all the statements and documents that that person needs for if they get audited by the IRS or if they need to have it for their own purposes. So it ties it right from the enterprise to the advisor all the way down to the client.
I agree. And I would say, to expand on that, with Daniel, what you mentioned, it also depends on the characteristic and, let's say, the licensing type of that professional. Are you a broker-dealer looking at the world from an administrative perspective where by accident, whether intentional, unintentional, you've put that document, say, at your clearing firm's document repository section? So let's say you have 7 years worth of documents on NFS or on purging. And for example, you've never really put it in a true independent digital vault with archiving perspective. Then the other question is, well, how are you managing those OBAs? If you are a RIA, how are you managing that? And are you putting it, say, at a Schwab in their Schwab document area, or are you just leaving it there? Are you putting it into your own standalone instance? Have you thought about those things in a world where I think now is the time to think about those things?
Couldn't agree more there, Franklin. Appreciate that. Thank you both for providing color there. The last challenge or concern that we're going to talk about is, again, one that, we see all of these quite often, but this one is one that we see more than we definitely should see. And it's about the widespread use of non-secure and non-compliant file sharing tools and practices that are still being used almost daily by any type of wealth professional. So whether information or documents shared with a client, with a partner, a vendor, with someone internally amongst your staff, there's key information in those documents and that information that's being shared that probably shouldn't be shared over email, as an example, which, email is still heavily relied on a lot more than it should. And speaking on that one, I had mentioned earlier that I have a quick anecdote that I'd like to share with the group. And it's actually directly related to this challenge here, the non-secure and non-compliant file sharing practices. So this was probably about 2 to 3 weeks ago now. My sister-in-law actually called us, my partner and I, to share a little bit of news, but also, she was a bit flustered, wasn't sure what to do. So she was kind of looking for some advice. So her and her husband's financial advisor, unfortunately, and of course, unintentionally, made I would say a very easy mistake to make, but a very costly one to make. And so an email was sent to the both of them, which contained account information, portfolio updates, I'm pretty sure as well too, along with, the corresponding documents. And on those documents, there was also personal information. So you can think of account numbers, balances, social insurance numbers were actually contained in those documents as well too. And as you may have guessed it, by the way, I've been teeing this story up, that email was actually just not sent to the two of them. It was actually sent to the advisor's entire list of contacts, I think client list, but nonetheless, you can imagine 300 to 400 of your clients receiving information that they should not be receiving, very sensitive personal information. And so the potential consequences of, such a small unintentional action really might come back to haunt this advisor. And I know that there are some consequences that are, being taken place right now in real time still with the particular advisor. And so, there's a lot of costs that come with that. Of course, fraud could potentially happen, the cost of additional insurance, which was paid for. So consumer protection some fines could take place. And of course, there's always the risk of being let go if that does happen. And I think above all of those things, though, maybe one of the most detrimental costs or risks associated with it is trust, or rather mistrust. And not just by, in this particular scenario, my sister-in-law and her husband, but also the 300 to 400 other clients as well, too, that might actually have opened up that email. And so I can only imagine, and I sympathize for the advisor, probably a ton of stress, a lot of anxiety, guilt, concern, must have just been going through their head when that was happening and when that first took place. And I can only imagine the level of conversations that took place afterwards. Not just with my sister-in-law and her husband, but maybe a chief compliance officer, a data officer, whoever would have been involved in those conversations afterwards. But I think the important takeaway here, and tying it back to really the value proposition of a secure digital document vault, and there's a broader message here that needs to be echoed, is just that, for anyone and everyone involved with sharing, sending, receiving, managing critical client information, let's use client information as the example here, just, think twice before you're doing it over email, or before you use some sort of non-secure, maybe a tool or a solution that isn't approved by maybe your broker-dealer, or your head office, or your compliance team. And, unfortunately, in this case, and in many cases, as this happens all the time across the industry, this could have been avoided altogether. So technology has come a very long way in a short amount of time, and it exists for a reason, for scenarios like this, to avoid it, to safeguard, the advisor, their practice, the broker-dealer, or the firm's reputation, and most importantly, to make sure that you're protecting your client's information and your data. And so, the question is there a better way to manage and send these documents? I think, we all know the answer to that, and that would definitely be a yes. So I just wanted to share that, as I thought it was a very relevant and timely, unfortunate event that took place, but, one that we can all relate to here. Next up on the docket, we're going to be talking about Rule 17A4, in particular, Section F, which is all around the worm requirement, but there's been a new amendment. Is that right, Franklin?
Yeah, I would say the funny thing with rules, the worm standard, is that most people may not appreciate, but it was created in 97. So the worm standard was created in 1997 in a world where everything was on a disk drive. Everything was very cumbersome in the sense that it takes a lot to stand it up. So the comparable cost is, if I was going into that old standard, I'm going to spend actually about $10 million to stand up 1.2 every single year to maintain that. Now, the irony of it is that most of the time, FINRA doesn't even look at the worm unless they have a concern that the original documentation was somehow altered, that they really need to go back into it. So you're spending about 1.2 million a year on maintenance over a legacy system where it's really just a snapshot of the original in time, when in reality, the business, the broker-dealer, the advisory firm, the wealth management firm, whatever you want to call it, they're essentially going into other more business retention systems, call it that, and updating a lot of information. It could be the CRM. And I think that's where naturally we fit into the conversation around that CRM aspect. And the new 17A4, the alternative for audit trail, you never want to say regulators are innovative, but in this case, I will give credit to the regulators. They are innovative. They really focus a lot on the language. If you think about how this amendment came across, they sent out massive time for commentary from the industry. Everyone got back to them, and they really were careful in their choice of words to say, this is really meant to adjust for whatever standard, because it's meant to be a audit trail alternative to worm, which, by the way, lower cost. So like I mentioned, you're on worm, you're spending as a large broker dealer, 10 million upfront, 1.2 every year for maintenance. On an audit trail for like FutureVault, what I've seen you guys do, a broker dealer can easily say, well, I'm going to go to 1.2 million stand-up cost and 120 to 250K a year in maintenance. That's a huge 9 million plus in savings in a world where kind of like a trailer in a world where you do need savings that we're entering into, like this is not only welcomed, but this is, I think, the new standard going forward. And many firms may not be aware of that because honestly, worm is something that's always been in place. As I mentioned, since 97. I'm sure there are plenty of firms that haven't even looked at the rules. Because when's the last time you woke up in the morning and think, I'm going to read the SEC Rule 1784 because that's the most amazing thing I'm going to put together with my cup of coffee in the morning? Says no one ever.
Yeah, I mean, I would also just chime in there quickly too, that kind of historical perspective of the worm rules and the on-prem legacy platforms. And as we move to a cloud environment with a lot of firms moving to the cloud, that's all great. It reduces your cost and your infrastructure costs. But that said, you still have to comply with the regulation, right? So that audit trail of documents and exchanges between a head office to an advisor to a client, right? So even though we've reduced the cost or potentially reduced the cost of having all those on-prem services and data storage requirements move to the cloud, we have now modern platforms to handle all of that and still maintain compliance. So I agree. The SEC has been very accommodating, very innovative. They're trying to react to the changes in technology, and you want to have a platform that can also move lockstep with the regulation as it changes. So that always kind of mark to market, what I call, between a change in regulation and a change to my policies and procedures, my tech stack, so that I'm not overspending, I'm not underspending. I'm always kind of lockstep as the regulation moves, and the regulation is changing more frequently now. So how do you stay on top of that? How do you change with regulation that has to ripple through the organization? How do you know that all of your staff have read the new policy and procedure? How do you know that the staff are following that new policy or procedure? And so having an enterprise platform with audit trail capability, with documents for evidencing and artifacting that you're doing what you're saying you're doing again, that's all a good development with the technology and the SEC adopting and updating their compliance rules.
Yeah, and, when we met Daniel and Christian at FutureVault, I was quite fascinated and in many ways taken back by the amount of global perspective you've had, Daniel, when you were at HSBC. So when you're at HSBC, you're essentially looking at it from a global perspective. I was always curious, what was it like when you go from that global perspective and then you go to this more niche FINRA area of regulatory coverage? Like what are your takeaways? I was always curious about that.
Yeah, so you can imagine if you're dealing in multiple jurisdictions or one jurisdiction, you have compliance and you have regulatory requirements, right? So what you always want to be able to evidence, whether you're global, local, regional, is that point I made earlier. You can stay lockstep with regulation as it changes, and you can quickly evidence that you can disseminate information to your advisors and clients. You can demonstrate your following procedures as those regulations change. And then you can mitigate that observation or criticism that, okay, my firm wants to grow, but I'm becoming too big to manage. How do you mitigate that risk? What tools do you have so that you can grow, you can scale? You're not going to break a regulation in a particular state or a country or a different part of the world. So it was always a challenge around, growing the operation, cross lines of business, not just say retail, it could be across an investment bank, making sure that you can grow, you're not becoming too big to manage, you can demonstrate compliance on demand through documents and evidencing and audit trails to a regulator. And if you can do that with comfort, then you can go to the business can grow comfortably, and you can be satisfied that you're going to be compliant wherever you happen to operate. So whether you're global, regional, local, that evidencing, that ability to do this real time in particular, without the disruption of having to stop your business, gather evidence and provide to a regulator, that's massive. And it gives you the confidence to focus on your business, focus on the client, and you're doing it and staying compliant at the same time.
Yeah, I've always found that to be, when I learned a lot of that from you, and I looked at, say, the CRM aspect where we situate and help a lot of broker-dealers integrate systems into, say, Salesforce, financial services cloud, we're seeing not only the vault being the single source of truth, but it's also like the archive truth of what happened with the client. So I always thought that was really interesting when we look at the audit trail, where from a digital perspective, the audit trail, in the way, at least the way FINRA and the regulators have worded it, it basically enables you to say, okay, I can now have something that is more digital centric. It could be today on desktop, it could be tomorrow on a VR headset, which seems to be kind of where the world's going anyways. And in many ways, it's fascinating to see how the regulation in many ways, and this only came out like a couple of years ago, so this is fairly fresh of an amendment, and we're seeing that as the trend goes to more digital, that there is actually an audit trail alternative, which I think was very cool.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, guys. And Franklin, just on that note, with the recency of this amendment and kind of just being passed and inserted into the rule as an alternative to the worm requirement, what are you noticing and what are you seeing with some of the reactions with broker dealers and RIAs and how they're reacting to it? Is it a large area of focus right now, or is it still one of those new amendments that there isn't too much chatter about it right now?
That's a great question, Christian, because I would say when the good times are good, when the bull market is here, the last thing people think about is compliance. But we're not in a bull market. The volatility of what's affecting risk on many different levels, put it that way, to summarize in a clean statement, is affecting not only purchasing decisions on technology.
Right.
I would say between 2015 to 2020, every broker-dealer's purchasing decision was fundamentally allocating towards pushing sales technologies, marketing, safe marketing, put it that way. And at the same time, after 2020, you're essentially saying we're going to start slowing down that purchasing decision and allocate more towards defensive technologies. And that's where I think this becomes very relevant. I would say over the last 12 months, we're seeing a tremendous demand for this. Now, I'll have two great examples. One of them is in the old worm fashion. Again, the old world, 10 million a year, 1.2 million a year to maintain, which on a system that nobody reads, which is insane. You were also required to notify FINRA with what they would call the DEA. It's not the DEA that's cool and exciting. It's really more the designated examining authority that stands for DEA to, kind of communicate with the regulators before employing basically a electronic storage media, in this case is 90 days in advance. So that was the old world. In the new world of audit trail, you do not need to require or have a third party be in between a broker dealer and the regulator regarding this entire electronic system. You can actually just have the executive officer and support staff within the company adopt this and use it, so long as FINRA can say, okay, that system is perfectly fine for this new digital audit trail. Again, that new model, far less, only like 120 to 250K a year, what they've expected to be annual upkeep. So not only you're saving, you're playing the defensive position, but you're giving your team a digital solution. So we're seeing that across the board for a lot of broker dealers, especially in a world where we're seeing broker dealers consolidate even more because of the hybrid model, right? In the old world, these FINRA broker dealers are commission-based, annuity-based salespeople. Now, over the last, I would say 5, 6, 7 years, with the, call it, institutional capital coming into the RIA space, that RIA hybrid model is a standard. There's no way in or out about it. And so this we're seeing as a most heightened demand. And I would say this as well, on the SEC side of the house, for larger RIAs where you're 1 billion above, the audit trail in a document is actually even more prevalent, even more of a requirement. And I would argue that the SEC camp of registered independent RIAs of 1 billion plus in AUM are at least ready for an audit review, because during the bull market, I will guarantee most of the RIAs in the ecosystem probably didn't really have that much of a strong SEC audit. But we're seeing across the board of friends and clients alike on the AppCrown side, the SEC is coming back to say, okay, we're going to have an audit review this year. But by the way, since I haven't talked to you for the last 2 years, we're going to have a 2-year look back period while we get a chance to hang out for coffee and donuts. And that is a very unique perspective to take of what is a priority as a firm. So if you think about it, let's say over the last 2 years, I went from 500 million AUM to about 2 billion. Hypothetically, let's say there's a firm out there that's like that. Well, I guarantee you that firm was not really audited in a more stringent, under the microscope fashion that they're probably going to get this year and the next couple of years going forward. People have to understand there's a correlation between volatility in the equities markets and also the more stringent demand of the regulators on these firms.
Yeah, and I think that's the part there. That's a really good point. I think that's the part that kind of both frights me, but also knowing where and how we operate, FutureVault, that is, in the ecosystem and what we can do for firms excites me, because there's a lot of opportunity for us to come in and say, hey, look, we can help you, better manage all of the information, the documents that are spread across your entire organization, from head office and back office to advisors, the OBA side as well too. And then of course the client in the household documents like we talked about. So a lot of opportunity there. I think the main takeaway here is that the audit trail is really this new innovative technology, and has been listening and observing to, where the market need really is, and improving some of those old existing rules and the sections within them, which, is always a good thing. So I think that's probably a good segue for us now to talk about something else that's pretty new, or that has just kind of come in recent times. This was about November 4th when this officially passed, which is the new marketing rule, and really understanding what this means for firms and advisors with respect to advertising. And the one thing, and Franklin, I'll turn this over to you, but the one thing I do want to just relay here that I think is really interesting is that the SEC actually redefined, when they proposed this new rule and when it came into effect, the SEC actually redefined the term advertising. And now advertising actually covers pretty much anything related to communications regarding securities, both to clients as well as your prospects as well too. So any type of communications, whether that's email, digital, print, you name it, has to be archived. There has to be a record of that somewhere for you to evidence for the SEC. And so I think that's a key takeaway, but it's what else should firms be mindful of, because this is such a new change to the way just they have been operating. I mean firms, in particular registered investment advisors. It's such a change to how they've been operating their business models. And now this feels like an additional new step, but maybe it doesn't have to, right? And so, what can firms really do here, both Franklin and Daniel?
Oh, actually, it's interesting to bring this up. I think, advisors are and reps are different, because an advisor operates on a fiduciary perspective, which implies the reason why I would buy Salesforce Financial Services Cloud, throwing an example, is because Salesforce Financial Services Cloud has that householding data model to integrate into. So that's where we kind of found you guys, and seeing a lot of advisors from Baylor and others that say, hey, listen, I'm going to use FutureVault as my core true single source of truth, and then let's bring that pieces of that over into Salesforce. And the householding feature is super important, and this is part where I'll turn to Daniel. Is when I saw, Daniel, you guys had that patent and that visualization tool on householding, I thought, my God, this is exactly what the advisors need, because perspectives matter, right? The lens matters. And for a rep, I'm going to look at the world as an account. I'm going to look at it as an annuity. I want to talk to you about this particular product or structured product that I think is going to be great for you, regardless of your entire financial plan. Don't care about that. Financial advisors say, I look at the whole big picture. I need that household view. So when I saw, Daniel, your company's platform on that, I thought it was really interesting. So I was curious, talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's incredibly valuable for the industry.
Yeah, no, good point. So the whole idea is the holistic view of the relationship. And to Christian's point about, okay, again, this is back to our thesis that regulations change. So these regulations need to be mapped into a firm and into practice and operating procedures. And so when you're looking at it from the holistic advisor perspective, that event of, let's say, talking about a new product or a prospectus or whatever that particular action may be, before that might not have been an auditable action or event, i.e. you wouldn't have to prevent that in discovery or show that in discovery. Changes like this mean that, okay, my business rules have to change. I've had this touch point with a client. I need to evidence and memorialize that I've had this interaction with a client. And that could be, again, here's the scenario portfolio analysis. And there are tools out there that do that. But it's now the ability to say, okay, right-click, memorialize. So that then gets captured in a vault. So when the audit happens, you can say, look, we had these different, you're almost like you're reconstructing the timeline that we've had these 3 or 4 discussions. Here's the corresponding evidencing documents that went with that discussion. And I can stitch together that whole interaction with a client. And that helps protect the client for taking on risks that they may not be suitable for, and also the firm and the looking at, okay, we're following this new regulation and we know we can evidence it again as real time as possible. So as regulations change, just like this one, how was my tech stack changed? How would my procedures changed to adapt to this? Sometimes it might not be material, but sometimes it is material. Sometimes it means I need to change my operating procedures for an advisor to say, okay, when this happens, you need to right-click, send that, memorialize that into a vault, or you automate that. You automate the memorialization of sending out that new prospectus, sending out that new proposal, and that also gets copied into a vault type construct, and you're covered. So again, synchronizing regulatory change with your procedures and policies and the tech stack. And that's where we come in, because these things are going to happen all the time. And it's about protecting everyone, the investor, the broker-dealer, the RIA, et cetera, protecting the whole industry.
Yeah, I agree with that statement too, because, if you think about it, and this is something that I have really more of a question, and I pose it really as an industry question. It's a lot of these advisors have evolved over the last 5-6 years to become pseudo family offices, or they say they're multi-family office because maybe they have 10% of their clients that's a mega ultra high net wealth, that's a qualified purchaser by definition, and they are marketing to them alternative investments versus, say, the other clients that are not, say, qualified purchasers, but they are really less marketing them alternative investments. But then you argue as a fiduciary, every 55-year-old, every 60-year-old with the same investment policy statement is kind of all the same. So it's kind of a question of, what did you market to the super high net wealth guy that technically, isn't really protected or doesn't need that much quote unquote protection from the general rule for the general population? And let's say that alternatives went sour, the NAVs have gone down dramatically in this environment, and you go on a look back basis for that RIA that has gotten into that alternatives game for better or worse to accommodate the client, because that was part of their value proposition. On the look back basis, to your point, Daniel, the broad industry question, even on my side, is how have you protected yourself against that? What was the initial prospectus and the subdocs and everything that you have presented to that 10 million, 20 million, $100 million family, and all of a sudden that investment is now worth $0. So, what did you do?
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, it's when a buyer market hits, when there's volatility in the market, that's generally when these issues emerge. And so you don't want to be on the back foot. You want to be able to, again, adopt these new practices that align with the regulatory change. Is there for a reason to protect the investor and the market, and ensure that you're compliant and the business rules around that. If my risk profile is this, and I'm selling a product that sits out of that risk profile, and the rules around it, like that there's an audit trail that says we've sent a product out with a risk rating of this to a client with a risk profile of that, and it's not reconciled. Well, that's a rule. That's an event that can drive a compliance officer to come in and say, look, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, and make sure that everyone's following the new rules. So that's exactly right. When the tide comes out in a market like this, you want to be able to have and prepared for evidencing the conversations, the audit trail, the discussions, and to have that, again, in as much as a real-time environment as possible.
I agree with you.
Yeah, likewise. All good points there. I think, unless we want to continue talking about this, I just want to be mindful of everyone's time as well, too. I want to make sure we can cover some of the other topics we want to talk about. We can jump into that third ruling that we wanted to talk about today, which is all around vendor due diligence. And, how do you as a firm make sure that you're confidently meeting some of the requirements? And that is, the SEC recently proposed new oversight requirements that specifies that when you're engaging with third-party vendors, at least certain activities with third-party vendors, you need to keep and maintain records related to the due diligence, to the monitoring of the updates related to these vendors. So all things like, for example, SOC 2 Type 2 reports, any vendor assessments, any critical communications, probably all communications would be better, proposals that maybe you've received and gone back and forth with particular vendors. So things like that. And, the one thing I'll just quickly mention before we, have a conversation between the three of us is that, this is such a unique area that I believe will start to garner more and more attention. Franklin, you shared a really relevant example of that when we were meeting a couple of days ago. And we're actually talking about this in real time with our clients, both broker-dealers and RIAs that are leveraging FutureVault at the enterprise level, where there's this corporate vault piece of functionality that allows you to store and maintain all of your enterprise and compliance documents. So those could be your business insurance, anything related to your reps and your advisors, anything related to your taxes and your accounting, and your vendors as well too. So you could have a vendor folder in there and everything, and you can have subfolders related to all of the different vendors that you work with or that are beginning to work with. And then you can store the appropriate documentation in there. So I just wanted to share that little tidbit before we sort of have a discussion between the three of us.
Yeah, I'll just quickly chime in on that. And it's a two-way street, as you mentioned, Christian, right? So it's, being a software provider, we get vendor due diligences imposed on us. And similarly, from an IRA or a broker-dealer, they have to do vendor due diligence on their vendors. And evidencing, again, artifacting it, having it on demand, doing a refresh. Sometimes it's annual. You have to go back and do that questionnaire again, having that in a structured format and auditable. So year on year, if it's handled properly and structured in a vault-like platform, you can track delta movements on the answers back from your vendors, what changed, any change of personnel, any change of technology, et cetera. But again, it's all about being able to stitch together a point in time. Here's how we're doing. Here are the vendors. Here are the qualifications. Here's the journey they've taken. And again, it's like a timeline. Having all those available on demand, because everyone gets audited. Everyone has an auditor. Everyone has someone doing due diligence on each other. So imagine a world where you can just expose the answers to your questions through a platform. You can share it with a trusted third party. They can come in, see your evidence, but get comfortable and proceed with their vendor due diligence. So it's, again, making that more seamless, transparent, auditable, and less of a disruption to businesses on both sides of the equation, right? It's the person doing the audit or the due diligence and vice versa. You want to make that as streamlined as possible.
Yeah, I'll add to that, Daniel. I think adding that streamline and tracking that is going to be tantamount. Now, vendor due diligence on my side is, in one of my themes of seeing how the world evolves, is one of the biggest growth areas for vendor due diligence, but at the same time, it is the biggest gap for every advisor and every independent IAR underneath the broker-dealer who may have bought their own Salesforce, bought their own planning software, whatever technology stack they feel is going to empower them. And they're engaging with that vendor or engaging with that data migration company or whatever it is. Where is that PI sitting? If I'm doing data migration, did it go through some guy's laptop because he's a consultant for it? And how is that protecting me? To your earlier point, Christian, when this is in real time, we actually were integrating a lot of data securely into Salesforce. So AppCrown, Salesforce, we're all secure. Everyone's secured. The consultant was not secure. And the broker-dealer of record, national firm, I would say a top 10, said that this consultant is not secured and we're basically going to not approve that person. And I had known the CEO of that consulting firm and I say, hey, listen, let me go to bat for you and talk to the compliance officer and say, is there a way to revisit your firm? And I was probably the most surprised in the 13 years that I've been doing this. The broker-dealer says, once we cancel you because you did not pass security review, we will basically never look at you ever again. So essentially, it is a one-time shot. If you're not ready to play, you will never be ready to play, and people don't have the time to go back and revisit you. That's not what the game is. And I think that, to me, was an eye-opener because I've never seen that behavior in all the years prior. And I've been doing this since 2009. So that to me tells me, okay, the vendor due diligence for a lot of people coming into the game who may not, like you, Daniel, you guys have that global view. So in many ways, FutureVault has, that global view as well, inheriting from your experience from HSBC. But I can tell you, a lot of the vendor systems out there do not have the same global view that you guys have at FutureVault. And it's just really interesting and fascinating. Now, on our side, I will throw it out there. I actually view my clients as a third party. So I actually risk rank all my clients, when I onboard them for AppCrown, when we process our data. And we always observe, like, when they send me an advisor sends me their vendor due diligence, I would see it and I was like, yeah, we'll fill that out. But I would risk rank you as 1 out of 5, where 5 is great and 1 is kind of you just getting started in life kind of situation. So I do risk rank my own clients all the time, every time, and usually on a semi-annual basis. But it's fascinating where even for them, the ability to keep all this vendor due diligence into a centralized folder. So when the SEC auditor walks into the room, based to your point earlier, Daniel, it's a volatile moment. You need to be able to have that ready to go because it is a volatile moment in the marketplace. That's what people need. And it's fascinating.
That's an interesting point about the risk ranking, because you're one of the first people I've heard mention that that's something that you proactively do. Do you have a certain formula that you look into with regards to the different types of risk? And has there ever been a point in time where maybe you've had to present that to FINRA or the SEC and say, hey, look, like, I'm doing what I need to do on my side. This client is actually at risk. So from a liability perspective, the onus is actually on the client.
Yeah, I think there's probably 3 situations over the last 13 years where when I worked with a broker-dealer or one of their reps, they had a very opaque entity structure. And if you have more than one entity associated to your registration license, for me as the designated CISO for AppCrown, I would rank you as like 0 on a scale of like 1 to 5, being 1 is fine and 5 is great, 0 being completely AML risk all over. I would risk rank you. And if things get aggressive, then we would say, yeah, I think this is something where we need to be proactive on to protect ourselves. But, one thing I do realize, and as it relates to the vendor side, is that you get to 0 when you don't have a great way of papering, or you're masking massive different entities to purchase, say, my services of loading data into Salesforce. And you come to me and say, hey, I have like 6 Salesforce licenses. I'm like, well, why do you have 6 Salesforce licenses? That makes no sense to me. There are some weird situations out there. And, the number one thing for me personally is, do you have a system to archive your interactions as an RA firm with not just me, but everyone else that, I'm supposed to integrate with? And I will measure that against the bigger picture. And most of the time, the best ones I say out there have a digital vault like yourselves, and they're putting everything in there. And you're seeing, okay, this is a very mature mindset coming to play a very mature game, because don't forget, we're all in this game to protect who? The investor client. So to your earlier, how you started off this webinar, Christian, to that story and tying together, to protect that, you need a vault, you need a way to communicate securely. You guys have a great audit trail system. I've seen many advisors through from seeing you guys at T3 last year to over the last 12 months, incredible demand. So we're very proud of ourselves and honored, frankly, to learn a lot from you guys and you, Daniel, to, support that, hey, advisor, use FutureVault because maybe it's CYA on so many things in life.
Yeah, and it's about protecting the industry too, right? So I think and ultimately providing, again, that client as well with a secure digital vault. We're a vendor, we've been reviewed, a due diligence has been performed on us, or SOC 2 Type 2. It's all the way up the constituent chain, all the stakeholders up, that everyone's comfortable, that there's transparency, and we're meeting, the standards are there for a reason. It's not to inhibit business, they're there to protect the industry and the investor.
Yeah, very well said there, both of you. And Franklin, the sentiment is the same here on our side. I always appreciate, our conversations and learning from one another, sharing examples and experiences. Daniel, your point that you were just making there from, it's about all of the constituents, not just one or two of them, and it's about the broader ecosystem, is a perfect segue. Now, we've gone through the challenges, we've gone through these 3 different rulings and some of the considerations. Now let's talk a little bit about how firms can actually protect their enterprise or advisor and their client documents within what we like to call a secure single source of truth, that being, a digital document vault solution, FutureVault. We stand by referring to the vault as precisely that, as a single secure source of truth for your data, your documents, your information. Helps you overcome your compliance challenges that we just talked about, everything that we just tabled in this conversation now, but also importantly, enabling your firm, your reps, your advisors to gain operational efficiencies, do their job a bit better, make sure that they're operating above board. And importantly, let's not forget, why we do these things. Yes, of course, it's law, it's, the standard in the industry, but it's to make sure that you are delighting your clients, that you're providing the best possible service that you can for your clients, to build more trust for your clients and to showcase to them that you care about them, their lives, their business, their families, and so forth. I know we're kind of a little bit over, but it looks like we still have a good turnout here, which is great. We're just going to talk about some of the different areas, not all of them, that FutureVault can support these exact things right here. We'll tie that together and then we'll end things for today. Before we do, one phrase, again, that we always like to say is, what happens in the vault stays in the vault. And that's one thing that we stand by. And so let's jump into some features and functionality. Let's talk a little bit about the multi-tiering. Daniel, if you don't mind, maybe you can take this one about, we talked about the different constituents. How does that play, here with FutureVault?
Sure. And again, I'm conscious of time too, so I'll make this quick, but again, the platform is multi-tiered. And so what exactly do we mean by that? So at the top level there, you can see the back office, head office, that's where your policies are established, right? You got regulation. We just spoke about changes in the regulation at the SEC, about the vendor due diligence, about the marketing rules, about worm, et cetera. So that happens at the macro level in regulation. I need to get that replicated throughout the organization, starting at head office. I need to get my advisors aware. Here's a change. So the tiering simply means that documents and checklists and procedures can be documented at the head office level and ripple down to the advisors, support staff, and ultimately down to clients. Every step of the way, there's an audit trail. The advisors have their own vaults. The vaults contain their commission statements, the new updated policies and procedures, their pay stubs or whatever that may be. So again, the vaulting structure is like vaults within vaults for clients, if they have vaults issued by multiple providers, but from the enterprise, it's from the head office to the advisor to the client, all structured and with automation and auditing around that. So that's what we mean by the multi-tier. So it's end to end, and the end game here is delivering a digital vault to that end client and household. How do they have security in their documents? That could be their will, their estate plan, their financial plan, all in a white label B2B2C offering. So that's the hierarchy. It doesn't have to be that way. We can go straight to client, but we can do it in that here tiering and kind of make this an enterprise-wide platform, delivering digital vaults to the end user.
That's a great overview. And one thing I'll add there, you pretty much covered all the basics there, is just from an accessibility standpoint, right? Like every type of documentation that you need to evidence, access, archive, deliver, distribute, it all exists within technically one implementation or environment. There's just different roles and permissions and levels of how you access it, depending on where you sit and where you operate within the organization. And so maybe we'll just share a quick example here, Daniel, of how that would come into play for different types of institutions and firms.
Sure. So this is one of our flagship clients, and it's CI Financial. And again, you can see these tiers, right? Starting at the head office level for CI Financial and how the platform supports affiliates at the broker-dealer level, like Align Capital Partners, like CI Direct Trading. There are others, and how it starts at the top, moves into the affiliates at the broker-dealer level, ultimately to the financial advisor and then the end client. So each one of these tiers, the platform supports. So if your client has a complicated or holding company type affiliate structure, we can support any permutation of that type of tiering.
Thank you. We'll quickly talk about, and I can take this one here. I just wanted to highlight something that I think is pretty critical, and it is around the structure and how you provide more structure, which ultimately leads to accessibility and where documents get stored. So what you're looking at here, this is of course a white labeled vault. This would be what your investor clients would actually see, how they would log into the vault, access their documents. But these different tiles here actually represent different folders. Internally here at FutureVault, we refer to these as our taxonomy, or rather your taxonomy as a firm that you deliver to your clients. You can have multiple different taxonomies based on the segment of your clients. For example, if you're doing business with ultra high net worth, and maybe the mass affluence, you might have different types of documents that you need to share, receive, collect, gather, access on a daily basis. The power of having different taxonomies allows for that to be done in a much more efficient way, rather than, again, using different systems. And so this is just one example. And again, it's fully customizable. This is just one example at the client level, but at the advisor level, an advisor would also have their own vault. So maybe you would have commission reports, maybe monthly commentaries or something like that you would deliver to your advisors. Advisors would have access to. And same thing at that enterprise level. There would be a corporate vault structure that would mirror your business in all of the functional areas and the documents that you need to maintain and preserve.
I think it's a good summary, Christian, and I want to ask you, how would firms find you?
We're online everywhere. We're mostly active on LinkedIn. So if you just search up FutureVault on LinkedIn, you can also reach out to us over email, and I'll provide this afterwards as well too. connect@futurevaultinc.com. You can also reach out to any one of us personally, Daniel, myself, Franklin. If anyone wants to get in touch with you and learn more about AppCrown. Daniel, is there anything you want to mention here? Again, want to be mindful of the time so we can wrap things up.
No, I think it's thank you to everyone for joining today, and let's make this available for those who join. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Franklin.
Thank you, everyone.